So I finished reading this book, The History of Philosophy. This book I thought was going to take a lot less time, but it ended up taking a lot more time, probably closer to like 40 hours of reading. I thought it was going to take like 20 to 25, but this is a very long read for most people. 40 hours is very long for most people. So keep that in mind before you read it. Overall, I would say that this book was actually pretty good. I knew it was a good book beforehand. I've read snippets of it before and I've seen other people talk about it. And also, just based on how the book is organized, I could tell it was a really good book. But I can now confirm with 100% certainty that this is a fantastic book. So the idea here is to go over a general history of philosophy, including Eastern philosophy. And the way he goes about doing this is he excludes authors who may have contributed to philosophy, but they contributed in a way where it was them writing in their own field. And so he will exclude those writers. He only goes over the authors who are properly in philosophy and they're like only really in philosophy. So for example, if you believe that like Carl Jung contributed meaningfully to philosophy, he won't be included in here because even though some of his ideas should be classified as philosophy, he was primarily a psychologist, and so he won't be in here, right? That's kind of how he went about it. He did go from the pre-Socratics, I believe, all the way up to modern analytic and continental philosophy. And then after that, he does Indian, Chinese, Arabic, Persian, and African philosophy. So that's how the book is organized. He definitely has a great ability to communicate the ideas of different authors without being too biased. I didn't find that his representation of thinkers was too questionable. You can maybe like disagree on like the hyper details of the individual thinkers. I was really surprised, for example, how he accurately represented Barclay. I was also surprised to see how he could actually understand Sartre and represent Sartre accurately. That was surprising to me. He even talks about Hegel, and he has some interesting ideas to say about Hegel. He does spend a lot of time on authors he clearly better understands. So Aristotle, Plato, Socrates were given a lot more space than, let's say, Merleau-Ponty. I think that's how you say his name. That author was probably not given as much time because he perhaps didn't understand him as well as like somebody in his field who would understand like Aristotle. So it seems to me that he spends more time on authors that he better understands, which is fine. And there's actually a bias here to where I think even when it comes to continental philosophy, which is a term he finds contentious, he spends even less time with the individual continental philosophers, probably because they're harder to understand. And so it's harder to actually acquire a robust amount of opinion about these writers. There's one thing here that I do not like actually with this book is that he goes over analytic philosophy and he spends a lot of time on analytic philosophy. And I get the idea behind analytic philosophy. This is a bit of a tangent here, but I don't like analytic philosophy that much because the idea is that once you use like logic and clear and ordinary terms and adopt theories like the referent theory of language or so on and so forth, that you can solve a lot of the problems of philosophy. And it turns philosophy into like this game of looking for self-consistency and using highly analytical like mindsets to look for the self-consistency inside the philosophy. And he spends a lot of time going over those views and looking at how they don't actually solve certain types of problems. And that to me isn't where philosophy is fun. Like that's not where it's fun. Philosophy is fun actually more towards the continental side of philosophy, where it's people using grand brushes to paint reality differently rather than developing like hyper formal systems to look for a way to derive truth, not so much as to a way to paint reality. So that's the only part I don't like. Because I felt like I was dragging my feet through the analytic philosophy part. He does a good job of going over Chinese philosophy. Surprisingly, he got to mention all the big thinkers, and he did it in a way that didn't feel like it was insufficient for an overview. I understand there's a lot in Chinese philosophy, but you do feel like you got a sufficient overview of Chinese philosophy. Arabic Persian philosophy, he did say, for example, that he left out a lot of theologists because he thinks theology should be like its own field proper, and he had this argument that it should be in specific again about like just philosophy, and he says the same thing with African philosophy, and so as a result, a lot of the writers from that space that you would associate with the tradition of philosophy, he excludes, which is fine. Like I believe he excluded Khaldun because Khaldun was technically a sociologist, not a philosopher, though you could put his writings into philosophy. So you could take your issues with that, but overall, the book was fantastic. I would highly recommend reading it. It'll give you a great overview of modern philosophy and pre-Socratic philosophy. Even the analytic philosophy will be excessive, so you'll have a great understanding of that. It's a bit weaker on the continental side, and then it gets even a little bit more weaker when it comes to non-Western philosophies. But overall, this book is very solid, and I would say like it's a 9 out of 10. It might be one of the best books for a history of philosophy. The only other volumes that I can think can rival this is the 13-volume set by Cobblestone, which you're probably not going to want to read. But with that being said, let me know what you think of this book. I think it's fantastic. And bye-bye for now.